the data can be accurate. It can drive meaningful, actionable insights about your business without being specifically precise. So again, like when you're looking at numbers on a dashboard, just always knowing that there is fuzziness there. Again, like it can be true without being 100% precise. So that's one of the important things, is just this mind shift of understanding that data is going to be fuzzy and it's going to get massaged. We're going to take, the data that's coming in from all these different systems and generate truth by looking at it across the board.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel and Ben. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm pleased to be joined again today by my partner in crime, co-founder here at Parakeeto, Ben Zittlau. Ben, thank you for carving out some time to be here again.
Yeah, excited to spend a little more time ranting and raving.
That is certainly what we're going to do, and I'm really excited about today's topic because we're going to be getting into, I think, a lot of the philosophical reasons that we really started Parakeeto and took it down this path that still requires, I think, a lot of our clients and potential clients to rethink some fundamental assumptions in terms of how these data problems that we solve actually get solved. So with that, I want to start with just a little bit of background because you have run data operations teams at scale. You were in charge of growth at one of the fastest growing companies in Canada and ran an entire team of people whose job was to basically collect, clean, and analyze and report data. So just really quick background and why people should place a little bit of emphasis on your take on this based on your experience.
Yeah. So I've been working in kind of entrepreneurship and web entrepreneurship now for more than 15 years. And the context in particular that you're referring to there that I think is relevant is as an early employee at a company called Jobber, which is a SaaS business. And I joined when we were 15 people. I left when the company was about 130 people. It's now about 800 or 900 people. So it's continued to grow. And when I was there, I originally started more on the product side. I spent some time, I was managing the data ops and business operations. So the business data operations team for a little while I was there. And then also I founded the growth team. And our approach to growth was very scientific, very data driven. So kind of our starting point was, setting up all the telemetry to gather data across the business, analyzing that business, trying to set up telemetry to run experiments, analyzing that data. So a very data-centric and data-forward approach to trying to understand our business and try and tweak knobs and see how things moved within that business as well.
Yeah. And so I think it's important to note that, especially today in 2025 in SaaS, the idea of having a business intelligence or data operations team it's much more of a common thing that you're going to see in a budget, a line item on the P&L. Companies are investing in that. It's far less common in our industry. And I think you could, in some ways, reduce what we're trying to do at Parakeeto down to we're taking a lot of these best practices that we know work in data management from these other industries or large organizations, and we're trying to make them more accessible to smaller businesses that now have more data than they've ever had before. But I wanted to plant that seed, or at least set that context so everybody can know that these are not necessarily a lot of original ideas that we've come up with. We've seen them work at scale in other organizations, and we're just trying to adapt them to this different context that our clients are dealing with.
Yeah. And there's a really relevant little anecdote of that too, which is that when we went to start setting up data operations within that company, one of the founders went out and talked to all these other, rapidly, growing unicorn SaaS tech companies about doing that, about that process. And the consistent thing he heard over and over and over again was don't underinvest into it. You're going to underinvest. Don't underinvest. You're going to waste a lot of time. So when we started up, we originally hired like, I think it was like 2 or 3 engineers. It seemed like a big investment. I think we were maybe 80 people at the time or something like that. And it took us probably a year and a half, 2 years to realize that that team needed to be like at least 3 or 4 times that size. It was just like, even for us as technologists, we're used to dealing with systems at scale and data systems, and we really underestimated just how expensive it was to be able to support all the needs. Everything from the infrastructure that aggregates the data, the infrastructure that stores the data, processes the data, supporting business stakeholders. It actually is just like a really expensive part of the business to run. But of course, there's the reason that you do it is that there's a lot of value to be untapped by doing it as well.
So with all that said, let's shift gears here to the problem that our listeners are dealing with in their business every day, which is that they're often collecting lots and lots of data across lots and lots of tools, but they're not necessarily getting any insight out of that data or using it to make more money, to grow faster, to get to where they want to go quicker. So let's start there. Why do we think that that's such a big problem, and a problem that seems to be getting worse and worse over time, especially for small agencies and small service businesses?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because ultimately, almost all the tools that we use, maybe even all the tools, but almost all the tools, are basically just interfaces on top of data. Like you create a entry in a project management tool. Of course, that's just creating data, and then you have views to look at that data. So really, any tool that we're working with is just a series of interactions and workflows that like create data and then present that data back to you. So in a lot of ways, it kind of like feels like, oh well, you are getting insights into that data every time. Every time you pull up a ticket in a project management tool, or you look at the status of a sales pipeline in a sales tool, to some degree you actually are getting insight out. But also in those tools, the ways in which you're able to look at that data are often very hard coded and very static, and generally more designed and focused on the operational needs. So, as you're using this tool day to day, as you're tracking your time, again, as you're managing your projects, as you're doing sales calls, how are you interacting with this on a day to day basis? And they often will have reporting functionalities. But often they're kind of an afterthought. I think a lot of the time they're almost more just playing the requirements bingo or checklist game, where it's like, oh, people need to see a burn down chart. So it's like, we need to say that we have a burn down chart. So we'll make sure we have this somewhere in the product. But often the reporting, when you actually go to use it, is quite limited and underwhelming. It doesn't feel like you're actually getting the insights that you want out of it. And we can talk more about some of the other reasons that happens. And then, of course, the other big issue is that in each one of these tools, they only have access to their own data. And so many of the most important insights require bridging across, the different teams of the company, which often means bridging across the different tools used by those different teams across the company. And each of those individual tools, don't have the ability to see across those gaps and connect those data points.
Yeah. And I'm sure that resonates with lots of people that are listening, right? Most of us, we've got a whole bunch of different stuff: accounting, project management, sales, time tracking, resource planning, et cetera, all different combinations of tools, right? We might have one that's doing several of them, and then a couple of little ones that are doing other pieces. And then trying to get all that data together is a big task. But of course, that's not a new problem. Companies have been dealing with this for a very long time, enterprise companies for decades. And there is an old way of doing this in a conventional wisdom, which really is kind of this source of truth, almost linear flow of data kind of approach that I still see a lot of agencies trying to solve this through. But if we go upstream to like enterprise, that industry has pretty much moved away from this to a more modern set of practices. So let's start with like, what is this old way of doing it, and what are the challenges with that?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of like two main ways that I think this has been solved in kind of like a Web 2 world. And by Web 2, I just mean internet software. So one of them that's been with us for a really long time is just CSV export. or a spreadsheet export. Like, let's take this data, let's dump it out into a spreadsheet, and then try and somehow get insight out of it. And often that's something that is happening off the edge of someone's desk. It ends up being an operations manager or a CFO, or somebody who's not really a data analyst. It's not their core competency, but maybe they need some visibility to do their own role, or someone's asked them to generate some type of answer. Like, how much are we over delivering on projects this last quarter? So they go and try and start doing things with CSVs. It's doable, but what tends to be the case is, first of all, it takes more work than is anticipated to actually pull those different data sets together, get them into a place, link them up. So like figuring out how to actually connect the dots. Again, you've got project names that don't match up, or maybe one thing is project names, and I think only is clients, or those types of issues. And then the other problem is that there's often just lack of cleanliness to the data. So there's a lot of work like trying to manually correct data. And then the other big problem with it is, like, even once you get through and you do all this manual work and you finally get an insight out, it took a lot of work. And that work often doesn't carry forward. The next time you go and try and do it, things have changed. Maybe the tools have changed, the way people are using the tools have changed, or it just took a lot of manual work to clean up the data to get the answer. So it's not very repeatable. And so all the time we see it where someone did it once, and then they never go back and regenerate the same type of report, because there's just so much work to do. And of course, also in that case, there's so much risk of just human error in the process of doing all that as well. And then the other way, which we have seen, and this is, again, in Web 2 been really common, and we still see today, is kind of like the integration. And again, salespeople love these, like, oh, you're using, I don't know, I'm just going to throw shit at the wall here. I don't know if these are true, but it's like, oh, you're using Harvest and Asana. It's like, oh, we've got a Harvest integration. This is going to work great for you. And the sales pitch is this dream of like, oh, you just press a button, and, it's almost now like they're the same tool. The data is just exactly where you need it, and it's there in real time, and everything links up, and you don't need to change anything about how you're working. Whereas the reality is, it's very limited. It doesn't push over this custom field that you created here. You need to change how you're using this one tool to make this other thing work. It like stops working and you don't know why. So that, again, it's something where it feels a lot like it's there to kind of convince people that it's going to work before they actually get committed into the tools that they're in. But it's very rare that it actually works really successfully within an organization. Or if it does, you're so fixed and static in terms of how you're using the tools. You lose so much flexibility in terms of like, oh, well, we want to change how we're using this tool. And it's like, well, that's going to break the integration, so you can't do that. It's like, oh, we want to change tools. It's like, well, that one doesn't have the integration. You can't do that. So like, even if you get to work, your processes and the how you use your tools get so fixed because of just this little tiny part of your business, which is like the integration of these two tools you're using, that like really should not have that much power over how you're operating your business.
Not to mention the fact that there always seems to be this fundamental assumption underneath most of the data systems that we see clients trying to design themselves, which is that the data is going to be clean to begin with. And inevitably it's not. And so this is what kind of even invalidates the idea of running a report inside the tool, is that you're often just reporting on data that isn't fundamentally clean or well structured or consistent. And it gets even worse when you start shooting that data around to all of your other tools and just kind of permeating the scope of all this messy data now living in a whole bunch of different places and needing to be managed. And, it kind of brings me back to this old saying that we've heard a million times, I'm sure, which is, garbage in, garbage out. And I have started to kind of push back against that saying, because it frames the problem as being an input problem, which is, oh, the solution is you have to stop the garbage from coming into the system. But the reality is the garbage is coming in whether we want it to or not. I've never seen a company be successful at adequately policing data hygiene coming in without having often a correlating decrease in compliance. So it's a losing battle no matter how you do it. Because if you try to be militant about input control, then you're not going to capture 100% of the data because it's too much work for your team to put it in. And so you can't win at the input game. So instead, the question is not how do we get perfect data coming in and send it all to one central place, the source of truth, right? Because this is another big thing that people get wrapped up on. So we'll double click on the source of truth idea for a minute. Is they say, okay, what's the one big system that we're going to push all of this into and then do a reporting out of? That could be in the agency space, a PSA. Historically, in enterprise, that's been the CRM or the ERP, the enterprise resource planning system. And that idea is kind of, again, fundamentally flawed for all these reasons.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point. So yeah, thank you for mentioning it. And like, just listening to you talk there, I'm, kind of thinking of analogies, because my brain always loves analogies. And the reality is that operational data is always messy in real time. It just is, because it's a living, working thing. So like, yeah, when you connect up these integrations that are going to be pushing data over in real time, that sounds great. But the data isn't really ready for that, or cleaned or published. So it's almost like if you were trying to use like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, and you had to tell your team, don't put anything until this document until it's 100% clean and complete. So like, you could never do a draft. You can't like write it, use it as you're working. It's like, oh, only write in here, do it somewhere else, write it by hand or something. And then only come here and add it when it's like done. It's like operationally, that's not how data lives. Data, again, some sales guy is going to be like quickly doing things as they're on the sale call, and then they're going to have to go back in and clean it up. Or like, people aren't adding their time entries. They go in at the end of the day, or they go at the end of the week, and they go add their time entries. And so that's the thing, is like, there's this constant kind of like, again, inherent messiness in operational data, because it reflects operations. Like, it isn't, again, this like it's not like financials that like are reconciled once a year, and then you can like say like, okay, now this data is good. And of course that has issues too. Like, how often are reconciled financials actually as clean and trustworthy as we make them out to be. But so, and yeah, anyways, so like, that issue of like trying to take data from one system and push it into another system without there being any kind of like, workflow, filtering, processing, is just, it just seems very naive in terms of understanding how the tools on both sides are actually used.
I'm glad you touched on the real time idea too, because we hear this a lot. I would hear it on sales calls all the time. Someone saying, I want a dashboard that shows me all these numbers in real time. And this idea of real time, like when you double click on it, is pretty problematic in a lot of areas, especially these compound metrics. And I'll come back to the analogy that you used. It's like, well, I could give you a real time feed of this data, but just like the document, it's like, if I go in and look at the document when it's only half written, is it going to actually give me the insight that I want? And similarly, when you have a metric like utilization, for example, you need these two very complete sets of data, one which is about capacity and one which is about the amount of time that was spent in that time period. And often the time tracking data is not being created in real time for all the reasons that you mentioned. You have different cadences of people entering that time. Some are doing it daily, some are doing it at the end of the week. And so you have to have some process to say, we have a complete set of data here in order for that metric to be accurate. Because yes, I could give you a real-time utilization measure, but then it would actually never be accurate.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because we're kind of addicted to real time as a society right now, and technology has enabled a lot of that. It's like the 24-hour news cycle. Um, but with, what we do, the question we're always coming back to is like, what insight or actionable decision is being driven by this. And I think that also like really raises a lot of skepticism, or at least uncertainty about how much value you're actually getting from these real-time representations. If there's course corrections for your business that you're making on like a weekly or monthly business, basis, that's the cadence that you need that data to be visible. And again, in real time might actually like not only not be valuable, but might actually have negative value because it's distracting. You're looking at it all, like again, at the companies that before, our payment processing and stuff, we could get metrics in real time. So many of the leadership people every morning would wake up and like look at it. I'm going like, what are you doing? Like, there's nothing, you're not gaining any information by looking at that every day, but it would like change how they felt about their day. When they woke up and like looked at like how much revenue came in overnight. So it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, it's I'm glad we talked about this, because the other thing that's true, right? And this is a principle that expands well beyond this, but often there is a compounding cost to, for example, increasing timeliness, right? The difference between measuring this once a month versus once a week versus daily versus by the minute, there is an exponential increase in the cost and complexity of that. Because as you start to pull on the thread, it's like, it's not just the reporting, infrastructure needs to be able to do that. It's like, what are all the downstream processes that now need to line up to that time increment? And then the question you're asking is the important one, which is like, is that even necessary? And it's almost never necessary. And it almost doesn't ever deliver an incremental increase in value or in speed of decision making or what have you. And so I think that's a really important principle.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
So we've talked about the problem. Data everywhere. We're trying to get insight. We've talked about the old way of doing it, which is, CSV exports. There's a time and a place for that, but probably not a scalable process for the bread and butter kind of insights that we need. The idea of saying, let's integrate all of our stuff together and push our data into one place and do all the reporting out of that also doesn't really work for all the reasons that we mentioned. So now the question, of course, that everybody listening is asking themselves is, well, what the hell am I supposed to do instead? And the good news is there are answers to these problems because big companies have been solving them in very expensive ways for a long time. And we're trying to make these things more accessible. So let's talk about this kind of new point of view on how to integrate these data sets together.
Maybe before there, if we can just spend a little bit of time just talking about the all-in-one kind of solution and maybe some of its challenges. So I think if you've listened to everything we've said so far, one thing they might be working is like, well, what about, these tools that integrate all this stuff together? So they integrate project management and your sales pipeline and the time tracking and maybe even accounting all into one platform. And they likely do have reporting that can report, across those different things. So like there's a context in which that works, like I'm sure there's going to be people listening to this who are going to go, well, like it works for us. And, if it works for you, like always, if it's working for you, great. If your business is achieving its goals, your team's working effectively, until you encounter problems, don't mess with it. Like first of all, let's get that out there. But there's certainly challenges that reduce the chances that that's going to be the case for a lot of organizations. And first of one of them that I think most people would intuitively understand pretty quickly is anytime you're taking on like an all-in-one tool, it's likely going to be less good at each of the individual things. It's like when you get worried when you see that restaurant in a business park that has like American, Japanese, Chinese, Thai, Mexican, and you're like, I don't know if that's where I want to go for lunch, right? So, like, yes, you can have a menu that has all those things on it, but you're certainly not going to do each of those different types of things as well. And some of that is that there's just resourcing challenges within the organization. How many engineers do you need to build all those tools? But the other thing is that when you're building all those things, what the customer's going to expect when you have all those things is that they're all going to be cohesive and integrated and coupled to each other. So that like there's views that are going to integrate the data from the sales with the data from the project management, with the data from the time tracking, and tie all that stuff together. And from a product development standpoint, that creates a huge challenge where you can't change one part. You can't change how time tracking works in the system without changing how every other part of the system works. So you kind of get, first of all, you need to choose one way in which everything is going to work in order to like make your product work across. And you can't change things. Like them as the product designers can't change things, but often you as the customer have very limited ability to customize how those things are going to work and how they're going to kind of integrate together with each other. So that's one of the huge other challenges is that often they'll have a very specific lens on the workflows, the way things can be configured. And if that just happens to line up perfectly to how your team works today, then that's great. But or if you're in a world where it's like we're willing to change how we work, and some of these all-in-one platforms might even like offer you significant amounts of training. You probably have to pay a lot, but they'll do like a whole amount of training. The upset of like you're not just adopting a tool, you're re-architecting the processes, the workflows within your business into this system that our software happens to work with. And again, in that world, that can be okay, but there's some problems even with that. But I'll let you fill some space too.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. Yeah, I mean, and look, there's a reason why in practice, I mean, we've worked with a lot of agencies over the years, and we've never come across a single agency that was using an all-in-one platform and wasn't still doing some level of reporting outside of the all-in-one platform, whether that was idiosyncratic limitations in the reporting system, which is often incredibly under-engineered because it's one of 5,000 features fighting for development resources at any given moment in time, whether it was that they ended up having to use a best of breed tool for just like one little piece of their workflow because that one didn't quite work, which kind of negates almost the entire value of having everything integrated into one place in the first place, whether it was the fact that they had data hygiene issues or that they were changing the structure over time, whether it was the idea that the dependencies that were created by intrinsically linking all of the operational level data to the executive level data made the executive level data useless because there was actually, it was unmanageable operationally to keep all the data accurate enough for the high level insights to even be accurate at all either. There's all kinds of reasons that from a reporting perspective, we've never actually seen a client be successful with that, even though there have been some examples where from a workflow perspective, there actually was quite a bit of efficiency to be gained from using an all-in-one platform because it happened to map very well to how they worked. But I think those are two very different problems. And this is generally the advice I give people when they're looking at these all-in-one platforms is get it for the workflow and focus on workflow, but don't go into it expecting to also get all of your reporting solutions taken care of because it's just in practice not really that practical.
Yep. And then just the one other big problem with an all-in-one is that now changing tool means changing everything across your entire organization. So like if they're not developing as quickly or just the industry is moving in an interesting direction in terms of, maybe say like sales data, um, sources, being able to infer additional information about the opportunities coming to your sales pipeline or something, and this tool doesn't have it. And again, their pipeline of product developments is spread out across all the different things that they're trying to support. Now, if you want to move away, yeah, you have to make a massive decision for your organization that's going to be massively disruptive. It's going to affect every part of your organization. There's going to be retraining involved, of course, huge amounts of risk. So it's way easier to get held hostage to the tool that you're on when you're on that path.
Now, before we transition to how do we do this in the modern context, because we do have to cover that, I will put on my tinfoil hat for just a moment and do my little conspiracy theory rant, which is, and I will counter my own argument here for a moment. But if we think about like why did this happen? How did we end up in this place where for years and years and years we were told, okay, it's garbage in, garbage out. You got to get everything into a source of truth. You got to have an ERP or a CRM where you pump all this data into, and that's how you'll get all your good reporting and data out of it. Well, if you think about the incentive structure of the massive CRM and ERP, the Oracles, the Salesforces, the SAPs, they were very much incentivized to have that messaging because the more data and the more processes in your business that you aligned to getting data into those systems and getting it in there well, the more entrenched you became into that system. And to your point, the less likely you were to switch off of it because the cost of that compounded over time as more and more and more things became dependent on that. And so it's actually true that we want to enable change and reduce the cost of that change so we can be more nimble. We want to build systems that are redundant to change, both in tools and in data structures. We want to build systems that are redundant to issues in the data because we know that all of those things are not only likely to happen, but allowing for them to happen actually puts us in a better position as a business. And so, the other thing that's true is 20 years ago, just the industry of data ops wasn't even really formally existing. We didn't have as much time and space in solving these big data problems. And so part of it is that the best practices didn't exist, but they do now. So now that we know more, what is the better approach? And maybe we'll dig into that.
Yeah. So first of all, maybe we can start with like more of the operational lens and then maybe move a bit more towards like source of truth and kind of the leadership lens and things like that. So as you're alluding, our kind of lens is we want to really enable the operational teams to be as successful as possible. And we want to enable that in a few ways. One way that we want to enable it is allowing them to choose the tool that's going to work the best for them operationally. So again, whether that's your sales team, your customer support team, your operations team, your delivery team, accounting team, letting each of these teams, as experts in their own needs and workflows and areas of competency, be able to look to the offering of tools that are out there in the market that's always evolving and answer for themselves, like which tool best fits our needs, and remove this coupling across teams. Like again, in my previous life, one project I was working on at one point was looking at changing customer support tool. And Salesforce was in the mix because sales was on Salesforce and they had tickets for managing their customers. Those need to be handed off to product coaching. And product coaching, of course, sits on the fence between success. So now it's like, okay, well, like, so now the decision of like which tool to use to track customer support tickets is now created coupling between sales and support, and then marketing got involved because of course with tools like intercom and things like that, marketing was increasingly kind of getting into like these chat widgets. And so next thing you know, like trying to choose the tool is now involving all these different teams. The requirements gathering gets way more complex, the trade-offs get way more complex, and again, you become way more locked in because to change something now involves going to 3 different teams. So we want to enable teams to look to the market to find the tools that best meet their needs. So that's one big thing. And then to allow them to change. So allow them to set up those tools the ways that are going to work for them. And then when their needs change or they discover what they're doing isn't working, to be able to change that and reduce that friction as much as possible for them making that kind of change or change tool altogether. And as we were kind of talking about before, increasingly, one of the things that really creates a lot of friction around that is the coupling just talked about, but then also just the reporting. So, whether it's the integration that again is pulling all the data into your source of truth tool, or it's spreadsheets that you've set up that are expecting the data to be a certain way. A team that wants to change something, but now they're coupled to these reporting data flows or tool chains. So they can't change the things in the way that is going to make them as effective as possible. So if you think about this across every part of your business, it's a huge amount of friction that you're creating across all your business, not to mention just the morale and frustration. Like it drives people nuts when, as the delivery team, they know that there's a project management tool that they want to use, but leadership's telling them no because of something outside of their own team. So, just like enabling each of those teams, to be able to choose what's going to work the best for them and set it up the way that's going to work the best for them.
Yeah. And so with all of that in mind, how do we then look to build a system for bringing all that data together, making sense of it, that is actually able to allow for not only the change in tools, but also the change in how those tools are set up, which we see all the time, right? We go into an agency and it's like, oh, we used to set up projects this way in Harvest. Now we set them up this way. And next month we're going to change the way we do it again. And so it's like, how do you make sure you can actually measure across that entire time period, despite the data schemas being notably different, for example?
So like the first thing that's unfortunate, but real, is that it's going to be hard and it's likely not going to be cheap. So there is a cost to it because basically we're accepting that there's going to be this new part of how the business works that's going to actually have to take on that problem. And as we mentioned earlier, in enterprises, these are data ops teams or business operations teams. So they have entire teams, analysts, data engineers, they have infrastructure that deals with these types of problems. And in a smaller organization, you likely don't have that or don't have it dramatically resourced. So there's a mind shift that's going to be involved. And it's not often a straightforward problem. The way that is going to look within each organization, even 2 different organizations using exactly the same tools, again, in terms of how they structure their projects, how they, bundle things together for customers, how their teams are structured, or just legacy, how they've worked in the past. 2 tools being used by, 2 agencies using exactly the same tools, the way to try and connect data across those things is going to look quite different. So like one of the best examples I can give off the top of my head is you might have a situation where in your time tracking tool, you only want people to have to track time against client because you've tried it before where you had multiple projects, but then people knowing which one of these different things to put the time against was just too much of a mess. So instead of just tracking time against client, but in your project management tool and your sales tool is broken out by project. So like, how are you going to stitch those things together? And depending on what information is available, maybe it's certain people work on certain projects, certain people work on other projects. Maybe it's the projects, based on the time that the work is happening or the type of work is being done, based on their context there's going to be differences in terms of how that can be accomplished. And of course, then what you actually need as well is like the tooling to be able to pull those things together. So that's one part of it, which is the actual like connecting the dots. How do you link up the data across these different tools? And not to mention on top of that, of course, again, things are changing. So how that worked 2 months ago is going to be different from how you want it to work the month from now. The tools changing, the way they're using is changing. So it needs to be a system that's designed to expect change and be able to do change effectively, and often even still preserve historical data, which is a whole other thing too. Is like, as the stuff's changing, as you're changing it, you want to change it for the data going forward, but you need to keep all that historical data, correct as well. So that's one of the huge challenges. And then, and I'll again create some space before I go on to the next thing, which is kind of data cleanliness.
Yeah, so I mean, all of those are, of course, the problems that we run into that need to be solved. Let's dive right into data cleanliness, and then we can
Yeah.
talk about some of the basic data ops principles that are really effective to handling this.
Yeah. So again, I'll give an anecdote from a past life, which is that, again, we, at this point, we already had a data ops team that we we're investing significant money into. And as leadership, we have a weekly meeting and we look at our company dashboards and we sit down and we look at a chart. And then someone on the leadership team goes, that doesn't look right. And then you start looking at the numbers on individual data points, and just between the anecdotal data in your heads across the leadership team, that one chart is not right. You don't know why. You can't see the why. All you get is just the charts with the numbers, but that there's something there that's not right. So immediately you don't trust any of the dashboards. So you're like, we're looking at these numbers, we don't trust any of them. So like, what are we supposed to do with this data? Like it might as well not be there, because we can't trust what we're seeing. So that's even in the world where you're trying to take on this problem. It's hard. One of the big issues with data in general is it tends to look very absolute. So like, of course, in science we use error bars. For some reason, in business we rarely use error bars. So we put a number on a chart and we say this is exactly what this number is. Where, for example, the number of hours your team worked on a project, there's fuzziness in that. No matter what, there's fuzziness. Someone's forgot to turn off their timer for half an hour. When people get up to go to the bathroom, do they stop their timer? They have a chat in the hallway where three people work on a project chat for 20 minutes about a project. Did that time get captured? Like, just that question, independent from the actual tools and integration of data, that question is actually a fuzzy question. There's fuzziness around this thing that we like to view as like a precise number. And then on top of that, then you throw the actual like tooling issues of, when people are adding data, if they're adding it accurately, this one person always rounds their time tracking entries up. You have this process of how people are supposed to be naming their projects in this tool, but like, these project managers, again, don't follow it. Who knows why? They're busy. They forget something. It doesn't happen. So you're going to have all these issues. And like, this is, again, where one of the biggest problems with the source of truth idea is the source of truth usually involves this expectation of very strong compliance. So like, wherever that data is going to be, that like, in the way that the data gets in there, again, because of the way these integrations are set up, often they're very brittle. So it's making these assumptions that things are going to be correct. Often they struggle to deal with things being deleted or changed or moved, so that they're correct right from the get-go. People going back and like re-editing their time entries after the fact, like, breaks all kinds of things, or that data just never gets updated. So there's these big problems with like a source of truth where, and not to mention again, that it says like, because of this one tool, we're going to constrain how everyone else can use all the other tools. And again, I think it is something that we've seen a few. Like I'd wager it's like 1% to 2% of organizations we've worked with, and usually it's where you have one person that's like uber detail oriented, um, and is the compliance czar that is on everyone's ass all the time and watching everything and is obsessive about it, and is able to strong arm or pull the weight or has enough cultural weight within the organization to get everyone very very highly compliant all the time. But it's rare. And again, even when it's there, it's like I had a friend at a company where they told everyone that they expected people to be logging 40 hours a week, because the time tracking compliance was poor. And then all of a sudden everyone's time entries added up exactly to 40 hours every week. And it's like, okay, you're getting 40 hours a week because you told people, but do you think that's real? Do you think those numbers are actually accurate, or are maybe people maybe just fudging the numbers to to match up to what you've told them? So anyway, so this idea of like create all this perfect data that's perfectly aligned to these procedures and policies, not to mention businesses are always going to have edge cases. They're going to be challenging those things all the time, and then put them into this one tool, and now that tool is going to be source of truth. Like, yes, you can look into Salesforce to see how profitable your projects were because you have your delivery data, your hours spent, things like that flow into Salesforce and calculate those things. So now the Salesforce data is like, literally you're saying this data is true. That's what source of truth means. This data is true. Where that's not what we believe in, and it's kind of not how we think. Like, first of all, one of the important ideas is like, what do we really mean by truth? And like one of our rants, which we probably don't have time to go deep enough into, is precision versus accuracy, which is that like it's more important to know that this one customer you're over delivering about 20%, and your other customers you're under delivering 5%, than to know that every time entry within your system is accurate to the minute. So again, when you're talking about like actionable insights, the data can be accurate. It can drive meaningful, actionable insights about your business without being specifically precise. So again, like when you're looking at numbers on a dashboard, just always knowing that there is fuzziness there. Again, like it can be true without being 100% precise. So I think that's a bit of an important mind shift. But one of the things that we try and do around that too is also communicate that degree of fuzziness. So it's like one of the things that we can do for our customers is report on the degree of compliance of the data. So like how much of your data is actually lining up versus how much isn't. And is that improving over time? Is that not getting improved over time? Which is just a really interesting business metric that often isn't looked at, is just like how compliant is the data across our organization, which of course affects all the other business metrics that you do look at all the time, but often don't think about. So that's one of the important things, is just this mind shift of understanding that data is going to be fuzzy and it's going to get massaged. So, we're going to take, the data that's coming in from all these different systems and generate truth by looking at it across the board. So, an example I give all the time is like, across your home, you might have temperature sensors. So you have 6 different temperature sensors across your home. They're all going to give slightly different values. And some of that's going to be real variance across, different rooms of your house. But like maybe, 5 of your sensors are saying it's between, I'll try and do US numbers because, 65 and 75, we'll say. And then you've got the one sensor that's saying, 32. Well, there's probably something wrong with that one sensor. And like as a human looking at that data, we're doing that type of inference all the time. Think about like polling data in elections. Like which poll is the truth? Well, of course, no poll, and arguably even in aggregate, no polls are the truth. But by looking at it in aggregate, you get a better sense of the truth than looking at any individual one. So that's like when we talk about like source of truth, it's about pulling all the data together and processing it, massaging it as a whole. And out of that, you can generate better truth, data that is more true than is ever going to be in any one system, no matter what integrations or automations and data pushing and stuff like that you have in one place. Like if you look at like what the data in your sales tool, your project management tool, your time tracking tool, your accounting tool, truth is a combination of all of those, and usually that's what I think leadership is an intuitive understanding of that, like aside from a technical understanding of it, that you can't just look at one area of your business to get an understanding of what's truly happening in your business. It requires a cohesive more abstract lens.
So, in terms of I'll just double click on precision versus accuracy a little bit, because I mean, I'm talking about this all the time on LinkedIn. We've talked about it on the podcast a couple of times, but like what's really ironic about this is so much of what we do when we work with clients is we try to stop them from their innate tendency to pursue additional precision, which is often, ironically, the thing that they think is going to get them more accuracy, but works directly against their ability to get accuracy. And the common example of this is like trying to do forecasting by doing 5,000 task assignments to individual people. It's like, well, those 5,000 individual blocks are very precise, but trying to manage 5,000 objects accurately is inevitably going to lead to an inaccurate view when you add it all up. And so it's actually a little bit counterintuitive, but the answer in that situation to answer that high level insight is you want to simplify the data. You want to make it, broader in larger buckets, so there's less surface area, so it can be more fluid. That's actually a better answer for that context where you're often evaluating a bunch of different scenarios. You have to move the data around. So I think that's a really important concept. And it plays into the next thing I want to talk about, which is, right, so we've described this different way of thinking where you aggregate all of the data and then you do stuff to it. You clean it up, you check it for errors, you transform it, you stitch it together, you normalize it, you get the data into a good state, and then you can do whatever you want with it. You can send it to a whole bunch of different reporting places. You can create different versions of the data. And you do all of this without necessarily changing the source. And from a practical perspective, we commonly describe this as ETL, extract, transform, and load. And that's not necessarily the best language, but at broad strokes, that's kind of the principle that's occurring here. And that is what's fundamentally different, I think, about the approach that we take and most modern data operations teams are taking to setting up how data actually flows through the organization. So let's talk a little bit about, what that is, why we do it that way, and some of the advantages there.
Yeah. So in the enterprise world, when we first kind of started down this big data, um, ETL data ops team, there's always talk about like data warehouses. And like the phrase of data warehouse is kind of this idea of like, okay, you bring it in, and in bringing it in, you process it, you get it all nicely sorted, organized, and just like in a warehouse, well organized warehouse, you have specific places on a shelf that you put like each unit of data. And quickly, what they discovered, or maybe not so quickly, but eventually they discovered that in an actual organization, a large organization, that's not realistic. Things are changing too fast. They're not consistent enough. There's all this movement that the data ops team will probably never be able to keep up with, or getting constraints your business so much. So there's this movement to what we call data lakes or data lake houses, which is the idea of just like grab the data, dump it in this lake, take it as it is, dump it in this lake. And then once you have it, you can, work with it, massage it, do things like that. And you don't have this like really rigid system. So, that's a lot of like effectively how we think is one of my big ideas is I always keep the source data intact. So like, I don't, we don't go to you and say like, oh, go correct all these things in your source system. I actually want you to leave your source system exactly how it is. Don't worry about that. We'll deal with that once we've grabbed your data. So we're going to grab the data and, do the best that we can in terms of inference. This looks like a typo in this name. We have a high confidence versus like, I don't know if these things are the same or the not. And then, working with the client, there's always going to be some kind of subjective process of going through, and understanding, there needs to be some understanding of context as part of this process, which is also hard. It's part of what makes it expensive. Like if we could just look to the data to answer every question, our job would be way easier. We wouldn't like it'd make us a lot more efficient if we didn't have to but usually what happens is we pull in the data and there's questions that we can't answer and we have to go back to the customer and have the conversations, understand the context. We can move forward from there. So that again, it is a very subjective, loose human process. And again, that's another thing that I think often is just misunderstood is the amount of human. And we'll keep an eye on AI. Again, that's another talk about what we're seeing so far and why AI isn't there yet. But right now, it's a fundamentally human process to actually be able to deal with this process of like, okay, we've got this lake of all this raw data. How do we again manipulate it and get it into the buckets, get all the lines connecting, get it as cleaned up as possible, deal with the edge cases, to be able to achieve what is again always our goal, which is like actionable insights. Like again, that it doesn't need to be perfect to drive decision making in the business, and like you're saying, that pursuit of perfect is often ultimately undermining the more important goals.
So I think this is really the big idea, and I think the mindset shift that I hope people take away from this, just in terms of how they think about setting up any system in their business that deals with data, right, is the extract it from wherever it's coming from. Give yourself a transform step. It's the greatest gift you can give yourself in this scenario, because it's what unlocks all of the mobility, the change, that we talked about earlier, and then push it into a reporting system. And the reporting systems that don't have that step and just shoot the data straight into the reports are inherently problematic. And if you want a practical example of this that you have probably been using for years, QuickBooks. It's not the best example of this, but in practice, you connect all your bank accounts, your credit cards, all the sources of financial data. And then QuickBooks is there to facilitate that transform step. And you have a bookkeeper that goes in, they process all of this, they create rules that automate things that have been done before. They will have to, apply judgment to a bunch of things that they've never seen before. And then if you changed banks, or if you started, setting up a whole bunch of different tools, you start using different vendors, or the vendor decides to change the way that they structure their invoice, it's okay. And you can still get all of that to match up and get into a consistent format. And so, you know, it's interesting that finance has really embraced this for a very long time. I think part of that is because of the very high standard that they have to hold the quality of that data to, because there's legal implications. But in practice, like there's a reason that accounting has worked this way for so long. And from a first principles perspective, it makes sense. And I think you're going to see that type of workflow exist in a lot more places. And we hope it'll exist in the agency space into the future.
And again, free up your operational teams. Like the amount of, again, restriction that you put on them in terms of the tools they use, how they can use those tools, changing tools. Not to mention just like compliance is, there's a lot of value to the 80% of compliance. For there being enough, like if the data is not there, there's nothing we can do. So focus on getting that, the Pareto, the 80% of compliance that takes 20% of the cost, and just accept that their data isn't going to be perfect, and stop being on their asses about it. Let them focus on doing their jobs, doing them well, getting shit done, and then accept that there's going to be this separate step that's going to happen somewhere else, which is to take, that imperfect, unclean data that's generated as a byproduct of people doing their jobs and doing it well, and then get it ready. And like, we didn't spend that much time, I know we're running out of time, be a whole other conversation about like what it looks like to then take that at like a leadership level. And the difference between that's a whole other big thing, is like the people using tools effectively to do their operational jobs day to day versus the leadership lens that you should be looking at the data of your organization on, and how those are actually quite different from each other. It's a whole other topic.
Well, that'll be the topic for our next conversation, which we'll have when you're back from, your European travels over the next few weeks. But I do think that that's probably a lot for the audience to chew on today. So with that, Ben, appreciate you coming back on the show, and we'll look forward to having you back. And let's say that's our next episode together, is the
Sounds
difference
good.
between ops and leadership. So with that, stay tuned, everyone, and we'll see you on the next episode. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.